past 12 months, and they've had quite a bit of success through that too. So,
Who ultimately will end up paying for this bailout package, though, Tim?
Well, if it works, it won't cost much at all because it'll be believed. It is guarantees and its willingness to say we will buy Greek bonds. Germany saying that, or the strong currencies, strong countries are willing to do that, and if the markets believe them, they won't have to do it.
Right.
But it has to have this backup on. They've got a real problem with fiscal policies that have caused the problems in the first place. The lack of fiscal discipline in place in the
I was going to say, I mean,
countries.
how did it get into this part of the state?
It's another failure of due diligence by the look of it. And this time it's not sort of subprime mortgages and things, it's whole countries which have been running a pretty lax fiscal regime, not collecting their taxes properly and then spending too much money and borrowing, taking advantage of the cheap money that the big Eurozone countries, like especially Germany, can generate and saying, we'll have some of that too, please.
And of course, you just touched on tax. I mean, I heard from some guy just who's been there in the past few weeks for a holiday, and everything he paid for, the retailer insisted on cash. Yeah. So in other words, there's obviously a huge black tax-free economy going. And what about also the retirement age for Greeks? I believe it's in the mid-50s.
For civil servants, I think, yeah. People who I suppose do have to pay tax, so they're getting compensation for that. Well, gosh, I mean, we're whining in New Zealand about moving it slowly up from 65, which I think we should do. Gosh, 55 sounds ridiculous.
Is this rescue package similar to what was unveiled in the US during their initial financial crisis?
There are probably some similarities and many differences. I guess the biggest difference is that the Americans were bailing out companies, banks, and the EU is trying to bail out countries.
Yeah.
So, slightly different story there.
Now, James, what will this do to our economy? Are we likely to see any flow-on effects here?
We've already seen the currency sort of tick back a little bit over when it was first announced, and then overnight, then there's been markets have sort of met the latest news with a bit of scepticism whether this is just delaying the problem for a few years down the track, and potentially that could be the case. The other thing to consider is if the European economy does struggle a little bit over the next few years with raising this amount of debt, and these problems have been around for 6 or 12 months and been highlighted, then that could have an effect on our exports. The European economies sort of makes up about 10% of our exports, so it's not massive, but it is significant. And the other thing to consider is if European governments are needing to raise so much money, and markets are a little bit scared about lending money there, then that might drive up funding costs around the world, and that would have an effect on us here in New Zealand. We do get money from Europe.
Now, turning our focus to last week's indecisive UK election, how is this impacting on financial markets around the world, Tim?
It's not indecisive anymore. I believe, as you mentioned, the news overnight is that Mr Cameron is going to form a coalition government, which is interesting. And presumably the markets will be reasonably happy having a Tory back in charge again. Yeah. And the Brits have their own currency, so there's no one to be contagious with.
And I believe they're going to have a deficit of 12.8% of GDP by year's end, which is actually worse than Greece. So it's a pretty dire situation for the UK, isn't it? What are the implications of this likely to be? I mean, is it even possible the UK could also be heading for a bailout? Well, unthinkable, but...
Yeah, but who would bail them out? Because they're not... Because they're out of the Eurozone, they can't require almost, as Greece almost could, require Germany or France, the big guys, to bail them out. I've never been quite sure what the British economy works on anyway. Apart from the City of London, it doesn't seem to have any visible means of support, so perhaps we'll find out in the next few years.
Well, James, the UK is a pretty important market for us, I guess, particularly for meat. I guess we run the risk of poorer returns for exporters if the pound weakens further. It's already at around 48p to the dollar. Yeah,
I mean, if we do see the UK economy sort of dive off a little bit, then that could have an effect on our meat exports. But to be honest, we've seen right through the recession, through the depths of the recession, then lamb demand has held up through the UK and prices have been really strong. So I think that's a good positive. It will be interesting to see what does come out of it in terms of the currency, because the key question really is, with the coalition, whether the new government is going to be able to make the necessary changes to their fiscal position and make the budget cuts, or whether they've got to play to different parties' hands, and there's obviously going to be some imposing views on how they go about that. So that's probably going to be the key question. And we have seen the dollar increase against the pound for quite a few months now, and that's I guess a good reason why we have been over 48p, and probably just back a little bit since that announcement overnight.
Well, as expected here, there have been a few hints in relation to next week's budget, and most notably John Key's $225 million announcement for research and development. Isn't there a bit of irony there, Tim, when you remember it was the National-led government that cancelled Labor's R&D tax credit when it got into power?
Well, there probably is. R&D is sort of a bit of a merry-go-round, really. Every government, almost every budget has something in it about R&D. I don't know whether it's just churning or whether it's a real policy shift. They do say that that's new money, that 220. There's a bigger package than that, but some of it's rearranging money. I think $90 million being rearranged, whatever
That's
that means.
my reading of
Bad
it too.
news for some, good for others, I suppose.
Yes.
But with R&D, people sometimes think it's a magic wand or something, and you look at richer countries do more, but richer countries do lots of things with their money that poorer countries can't do, and we're a poorer country. So it's not obvious that pushing money into R&D will have a big impact on economic growth.
I've also heard one slightly cynical view that companies can tend to sort of, shall we say, retool their operations to make it look like they really need to do a lot of R&D, which isn't really that meaningful, so that they can just get their hands on some money. I mean, does that happen?
Oh, gosh, I couldn't possibly comment. I think a good way to do these things is not to pay 100% of anything, but to say matching funds type things. So if the private sector comes up with some money for some R&D or some innovation, then maybe match it or top it up or whatever.
I mean, do you think it will actually support economic growth, which is, of course, the government line? It's going to make us a wealthier country.
Well, I think you can push or you can pull. I'm a believer in pulling money. If we've got a problem that we like, and I think we do have a problem of sustainability and environmental issues and things in the agricultural sector, then that should flag the sort of R&D you want to do, and that should pull the R&D. And so let's get into this sector and get these things sorted out. Pushing it, picking winners and things doesn't have a great track record.
Yeah, James, Sir Peter Gluckman has said that New Zealand's spending on R&D is far below comparable countries. Of course, being the very capable scientist he is, I guess he would say that, wouldn't he? But will this $225 million shot in the arm be enough to make us more competitive?
It's a good question. I mean, I guess what we have to be careful is that we're not going to see returns immediately. R&D takes a while to go through that process.
It's a long-term game, isn't it?
That's right, and we can't expect to see the return on that investment anytime the next year or two. I mean, it is a lot less than what was previously announced, but I think it's a step in the right direction in terms of building capability within the country, and I guess it depends on in what sectors that R&D does go to.
Now, James, Brian Gaynor had an interesting piece in the Herald last week discussing the demise of Craig Norgate and his partnership with the McConnon family. He suggested that the failure of RPI was primarily due to too rapid expansion, too much debt, and not enough equity. This sounds a little all too familiar, doesn't it?
Yes, well, I mean, unfortunately, there was probably too much debt through that whole system in terms of PGG Wrightson's, in terms of RPI, through that whole system, and that's a good reason why we've got into that state, and we've seen asset values decrease significantly around the world, and not only for shares in Wrightson. I mean, in terms of Mr. Norgate, then I think it's a bit sad to see him go. Of course, a lot of people have lost money, but he has been a real innovator in the industry.
He certainly hit the ground running, didn't he, when he